people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on a rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that my people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Again, the people grumbled and wanted to go back to Egypt, complaining of thirst. And in Numbers chapter 20, we read these words. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and command the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Thus you shall bring water out of the rock for them. Thus you shall provide drink for the congregation and their livestock." So Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and the livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me, to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." Welcome back to our journey through the wilderness, seeking blessings along the way, and what blessings God offers us and shows us in the wilderness in this Lenten season. And last week we looked at contentment. We looked at the ability to recognize where God's provisions are in the wilderness, and to know that we have enough, that God is enough for us along our journey. Not only did God provide for them in the manna and the quail, but he also provided in ways that strengthened their faith. And that's what we're going to look at today, is that faith in the ways that God provides that may not be as obvious as we may want. You see, even with the manna and the quail, we know that the people of Israel struggled to trust that there was always going to be what they needed. They constantly complained and thought about going back to Egypt, because even in bondage, even in slavery, if that's what it meant, at least there they knew where their food was coming from. They knew where the water was. They didn't have to wander aimlessly in the wilderness hoping that what they needed would pop up on any given morning along the way. It was set, it was structured, it was guaranteed. And the world has a way of doing that to us, of keeping us captive, because it gives us just enough to keep us comfortable. It gives us just enough to make us feel secure, and then uses us and takes advantage of us and tells us that we're only as good as what we produce. See, that's what slavery is all about. That's what bondage for Israel was all about. They were only as good as the number of bricks they could make, the number of stones they could pile upon the buildings. And yet, even in that bondage, even in that slavery, even in that oppression and that labor, that hard labor that killed many of their relatives and ancestors, even in that, there was this false sense of security. They were given just enough to be able to feel like they knew where their needs were going to come from. But in the wilderness, that wasn't the case. They had to walk not by sight, not by seeing what was going to be provided, but by faith. And that's what we see today. And God gives them glimpses to be able to build that faith. He doesn't expect them to have it right out of the gate. He gives them glimpses. He tells Moses, "Strike the rock and see the water gush out. See that below this ground that there is a spring of living water, that it will meet your needs. It will quench your thirst." And so Moses struck the rock, and the water flowed like a fountain, and the people drank, and all was well for a while. But as they move on to other places, they run into the same problems again. And again, the people complain, "Let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to the way things were. It may not have been the best. It may not have been ideal. It may not even be what God wanted for us. But you know what? At least we knew that our basic needs or met. At least we were comfortable. And so often in our lives today, we get stuck in that rut that we would rather have the familiar than what is best, even if that familiar is not pleasant at all. Even, quite frankly, if that familiar is bondage, is habits that have been destructive and harmful in our lives and in our relationships, is situations and circumstances that we have caved to, that we are not being our best selves, that we're not being our true selves, that we're not being authentic because we have to fit into this system around us that provides this false sense of security. And we keep saying, yeah, but at least it's familiar. At least I know what's going to happen. I know how I'm going to get through each day. But here in the wilderness, again, we're complaining. We've already seen God use Moses to bring the water up from the rock, and finally they're complaining again, and Moses is at another rock, and God says this time, let's stretch that faith a little bit more. Moses, it's one thing to hit the rock, it's one thing to break it open and allow that water to go forth, but I want to show you something. I want to remind you, and I want to remind the people that it's not your strength and your ability to find water in the wilderness. It's not your strength to be able to crack open that rock and get to the water that's already there. What you need to learn to trust is that I am the water, that I am the living water, that I am the source. And so God says to Moses, speak to the rock. Speak to the rock and let the water flow forth. And it would have been a beautiful miracle. A beautiful step in moving the people along in their faith. Except Moses is frustrated. Moses is angry. And rightfully so. How much more does he have to do to prove to the people God's faithfulness? And so he strikes the rock. Just like he did last time. Why? Well, we don't know for sure, but I have a feeling that some of it has to do with the fact that Moses got caught up in that whole familiar thing. He may not have wanted to go back to the familiarity of Egypt and slavery, but he was pretty comfortable with the fact that he had struck a rock before and water came out. He was kind of getting the routine, kind of getting in the rhythm, figuring out how to serve the people. And of course, as a consequence for his lack of faith, he never himself stepped foot into the promised land. He never crossed the Jordan River with Joshua and the descendants of Israel. Instead, we find that Moses leaves the people in the desert and lets the next generation go on ahead. All because he struck a rock instead of speaking to it. We can't blame Moses. How many of us would want to sit there when we've got a mob of people around us, a mob of voices in our heads telling us to go this way and that, and saying all the things that they need from us and all the things they want? How many of us would sit back and say, oh, hold on, quiet for a minute, I got to talk to this rock? We probably wouldn't. Especially knowing, figuring out the system that we know how to get water out of the rock. We know that there's an underground spring somewhere under here, and if I can just dig deep enough and hard enough, I can find it, and I can prove to the people that I am enough. But Moses wasn't enough. And we are not enough. That was never the point. The point was always to stretch our faith further. To trust God as the source. To know that it is not the water that we can find on our own. Not the water that we can hammer out of rocks or dig in wells made by human hands. It's the water from heaven. The water that flows forth from the throne of God himself. The water that flowed through the Garden of Eden. The water that flows forth from God's very presence in the New Jerusalem, the water that springs up and teems new life in the deserts, and trees of life on either side, and the water that flows all the way down to the Dead Sea and revives everything in it when once nothing could live there. It's the healing stream, the fountain of living water. And so, the question is this: would we rather live by sight, building wells and striking rocks and struggling to find little puddles of water wherever we can just to get enough to get by? Or will we take the step of faith to risk it all, to look the fool, to speak to the rock, and to trust that the rock of Christ will pour out the living water that will not only sustain and restore us, but will bring healing and restoration and hope to all the world? And so let us take that step of faith this week, whatever that may look like. The only thing you get when you strike a rock is a sore hand. So let us speak. Let us proclaim our faith boldly in prayer. And let us trust God for the living water that He has promised. Go in peace, and we'll see you next week.